Yeah, and another question that they have, it's people living not in the United States. They're looking at the United States and saying, well, the US and our sports programs seem to have so much money. So why does USA Team Handball seem to suffer from a lack of funds?
Yeah, no, great question. And actually, I am excited to get to answer that a little bit. I think the number one thing that we always have to remember that's different in the US compared to, well, every other country except three others is that Olympic sports in the US are not government funded, right? So there's no government entity. There's not a Department of Sports or a Ministry of Sports um, that supports all of these Olympic disciplines or non-Olympic disciplines. So we rely. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee is a private entity, private nonprofit entity, but we rely on private contributions and partnerships to fund our entire kind of Olympic movement in the U.S. And I think that's one of the biggest differences is when you don't have government funding, you you're just subject to a different set of parameters in terms of getting resources. And then I think it's also important to recognize that there are so many sports, right? There's so many different national governing bodies. And the biggest sports in the US are not within the national governing bodies, right? NBA, NHL, MLB, NFL, MLS, like that's all private entities outside of it. And
Yeah.
I think some of those entities have a big focus on grassroots. But I think it's important sometimes that just because we have a huge sports market, it doesn't always trickle down into kind of grassroots. And one good example is from Denmark that I like to use is if you look at the Danish Olympic Committee, a big part of them is kind of the recreational sport, like getting people to be active
Yes.
and play sports, meet other people. All this that's a big part of their purpose. If you look at our Olympic Committee, their purpose is to win medals, which in
Very
turn,
different.
yeah, and then very American, like they like that is very staying true to who they are. But I think that's one of the biggest differences. So there's not essentially a foundation of support similar to what you would see in other countries, and then recognizing that because the market is so big, there are a lot of big players. Also means that there's a lot of noise to cut through when you're trying to bring awareness to a niche sport like handball. So I think that those are some of the major challenges when we talk about handball versus part of the rest of the world, and especially Western Europe, is that there's not a government funded program, so there's no baseline of support. And then handball is maybe the and I'll probably say, but 15th, 20th, 25th sport in the U.S., right? So there's all this noise to cut through as we talk about awareness, both for athletes, but also for partners, which is what we rely on without the government funding.
On that note, you mentioned that yeah, the brand USA overshadows so much, so people think that we have so much money, right? Which we don't have. Maybe what is one other misconception that talking to Europeans you encountered? Like for example, for me as a coach, it's always like, oh wait, the players and the coaches they pay for everything, which it kind of is the money thing, but there are so many other things like how many clubs we have, how many courts, how the league system is. When you do you have like a personal story where you were like, yeah, no, handball in the US is not like you think it is?
Yeah, I think there's a couple stories that come to mind, but I think when we talk about one of the core fundamentals of playing handball, which is facilities, I think looking back at the city of 50,000 people that I grew up in Denmark, we had probably 4 or 5 times the number of courts that we do here in the U.S. for a country of 320 million, right? 320 million
Mm.
plus. So I think the number of handball courts we have always kind of sets people back because there's not many And Hendrik, I know you ran a question on LinkedIn as well on how many do we have, and there's almost no permanently lined handball courts in the U.S. right, and I think what our clubs also struggle with is access to facilities and the costs of getting access to those facilities. The fact that most gyms in the U.S. are set up to include basketball, which is not big enough to accommodate a handball court. So I think facilities is kind of the one thing that sets people back. It's like as a limiting factor that people don't realize because they look at the U.S. and says, "Oh, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of great facilities." And if you look at other sports and see the resources poured into facilities in the U.S., then I think that takes people back when you're talking handball.